When I first started reading A Song of Ice and Fire, I was about 16 years old. And when I say reading, I mean listening to. And the reason I started listening to it was because I was watching the Game of Thrones TV show, and I got to around season 5, and I thought it was really good, and I was like, well, I got to read the books for this, or listen to them. And so I picked up the audiobooks, and I actually started in a weird spot. I started at Feast for Crows. Sorry, I started at A World of Ice and Fire. I listened to that because I really was more into the world building a lot of the time. So I was like, this world building is really cool. Let's have a listen to the real story. So for some reason, I started at Feast for Crows. I think it might be because that's roughly where I thought the TV show was. So I did Feast for Crows, and I thought this book was insane. I thought it was like, I loved the world building. I loved the fantasy. I loved everything. I thought the characters were cool. And so then I listened to Dance, and I thought that was really good as well. And I really resonated with Jon Snow. Obviously, 16-year-old kid. What do you expect? I thought he was really cool, and I really liked his story, and I liked the whole story as a whole. And then I came back to Game of Thrones, listened to that, then, Clash of Kings, and then Storm of Swords. And afterwards, I was just kind of in this state where I was like, this series is so good. These books were, 50 hours long on audiobook, and I just chugged through all of it, and I thought it was so fantastic, right? And I thought that this was perhaps the best series ever written, as a 16-year-old, that's what I thought. And so, over the next kind of couple of years, I started listening to other fantasy because I was like, wow, Song of Ice and Fire is good. There must be some fantasy almost as good as this. And so I listened to like Lightbringer, a couple of other Brent Weeks stories, and eventually I found Brandon Sanderson when I was about 18, and I listened to Way of Kings, and I was like, this is really good. And over time I started thinking, maybe A Song of Ice and Fire is, rather than being like miles above everything else, it's like kind of just slightly better than all this other stuff. And then I listened to more fantasy, I say listen to because I'm always out doing stuff, walking, in this random forest or whatever, for example. And so I'm always listening to my books. And so I listen to books, and I also listen to books on free time speed as well. So I chug through them. And so I was really getting this, over a relatively short period of time, a couple of years, I was listening to kind of all the big fantasy series. I re-listened to Lord of the Rings, which I listened to when I was a kid, and I remembered how fantastic that was, and The Hobbit. And then, all the whole Brandon Sanderson Cosmere. I listened to Gentleman Bastards, I'm kind of listing all these, these big, basically any large fantasy series, modern fantasy series that you've heard of, I probably listened to. And over time, I kind of started thinking back to A Song of Ice and Fire, and I went back to it and I listened to it again, and it was still fantastic. But I kind of had a slightly different perspective, where I wasn't like, this is like the most amazing series ever written. I was like, this is another good fantasy series. And maybe still the best. But now, kind of as a bit of a retrospective, coming back to it, I'm 22 years old, so it's been 6 years since I originally read the series. And I kind of and now I have a slightly different perspective, which I'm going to put to you now that I've given you, a couple of minutes of background, which is that I think that A Song of Ice and Fire is actually just an average fantasy series. I don't think it's bad by any stretch of the imagination, and I think it does some things really well. I think one of the main things that it does really well is it puts you into the world, like, as in when you read or listen to the series, you feel like you are, you're being transported. So it's got this, and it's not just via the world building, it's not just like, the arbor is here and, we're in Westeros or whatever. It's not just the world building. It's the atmosphere that George R. R. Martin generates, and that's very much a factor of his prose. His prose is really strong and really almost unique, and he's a little bit Tolkien-esque in the sense that Tolkien uses a very deliberate fantasy prose, right? And it's very obvious that that's what he's trying to do. And it's perhaps hard to tell how much of that is deliberate and how much is not, because, this he was writing a long time ago. With George R. R. Martin, it's very obvious that he's deliberately using some of these prose. He uses leagues, and he uses words like mayhaps and these sort of things. And so the prose really kind of takes you into another world. And so I do think that is a strength for Song of Ice and Fire that is virtually unmatched in basically any other series I've listened to, which is that it kind of transports you. And that is the magic that got me into it in the first place. And so I don't want to take anything away from that. But I think that in terms of plot, it's where Song of Ice and Fire, and we'll quickly talk about characters as well. Characters in Song of Ice and Fire, fantastic. They really pop off the page, and kind of got that sort of grim, dark thing. And there's a reason people have been emulating it. But I think where it starts to fall down just a little bit is plot. And I think you could definitely make a big argument that a part of that problem is that the series is unfinished. But the problem is, I believe that the series is always going to remain unfinished. I think there's a chance we'll get wins, but there's no chance we will ever get... Oh, this lighting is a bit weird. There's no chance that we will ever get A Dream of Spring. So the series is not getting finished. But even without the series being finished, I think that if you go back and look at A Song of Ice and Fire as a bit of a retrospective, it's relatively clear that George R. R. Martin's writing style, he calls himself a gardener. He's a, he's writing as he goes. He's not pre-planned the whole series. And I think it becomes relatively clear the flaws of that system when you go back and read the series waiting for something to happen, as in some overarching plot. Because the reality is that this series is basically a bunch of different characters that never come together. They never interact. There doesn't seem to be any overarching plot. And then you could say to me, well, Michael, what about the White Walkers, right? Big overarching plot, the others, they're coming to kill us all. And I would say that that's kind of, it's almost worse, because then your overarching plot is just that everybody's possibly going to die. So it's like, it's like imagine you were telling a story like, let's say, House of Cards, The West Wing. It's like a big intricate plot, right? But then you're like, oh, and then the ultimate story is just going to be zombies are going to come and kill us all. And you're like, well, these two things, they don't seem related. And I guess that's the analogy I'm using here with A Song of Ice and Fire, which is that, you've got these intricate plots, these schemes, in the Red Keep and around the world, and, Daenerys is, over in Essos or whatever. And you're like, wow, like these plots are all interesting. But then there's nothing to unite them, nothing to bring them together. And you could legitimately say, but Michael, maybe this just hasn't happened yet. But I think that the unfortunate reality is it's not going to happen. And it kind of leaves A Song of Ice and Fire with this weird legacy, which is that it's a series of a bunch of fantastic little single plots, like the, different storylines that people love. I still, I'm going to be honest, I'm still partial to, Jon Snow. But, lots of different storylines that people enjoy, right? But the problem is that I think in reality, we're never going to get to see them come together. And we have no proof, really. And you could say, well, what if George R. R. Martin lived another 50 years and finished it? We have no proof that it would actually be any good. And I honestly think that you would have to be the greatest author to ever live to actually bring these stories together in a legitimate way. You know what I mean? And so I think that, as I say, as I think of this retrospective on A Song of Ice and Fire, I feel, unfortunately, that it's going to have, obviously the television show has tarnished its legacy a bit as well, but I think that it's just going to have this legacy of a series that had potential and had fantastic attributes to it, but that didn't really kind of bring it together, and I think that it's a bit unfortunate because I feel that had George R. R. Martin told a more tight story, had he gone with his original plan of, 3 to 5 books, we could have actually had, we could have cut out some of these characters, made the world a bit smaller, still maintained that immersive feel, and really kind of finished the series. First of all, that's the big one, finished the series. But second of all, told a more contained story that felt more connected, And so, and I don't want to leave the wrong impression. I still think that this series is fantastic, and I think it, if I was making a top 10 fantasy series, or maybe even a top 15, I would definitely have it in there. But I just feel that it's too disconnected. It's too, there's too many different stories, too many plot threads that aren't together. It feels like, it could well be a whole bunch of different stories being told in the same universe rather than one cohesive book, and I think that really hurts it. But I'll still say that I think that it's, as I said just at the start, I think that it's, its immersion is almost unmatched, and I think that's a strength that it has, and that's a reason why I will listen to it again or read it again, and I think it's the reason perhaps a lot of you will as well. But I think that if we are talking about beautiful art, good, fantastic art that comes together, tells a cohesive story, has a fantastic conclusion, it really brings emotion to us, as it finishes. I really think that that's not what we're going to get from Song of Ice and Fire, and I think that even if it was finished, that's not what we would be able to get, because I just think the story is too diffuse, and whereas, for example, I have confidence that Brandon Sanderson is going to finish Stormlight Archive, and he's got a lot of plot threads, but they all are integrated together almost already, so I have a confidence that it's going to finish strong, and even if it doesn't, that at least the stories will come together, even if it's not in the best possible way. And I think that's a really good point of contrast, as if we compare A Song of Ice and Fire to a Stormlight Archive. Because Stormlight Archive, also epic fantasy, almost as long, lots of characters, same sort of thing, but it's telling a slightly more cohesive story. The characters are all much more strongly related. They're separate to begin with, but they start moving together relatively quickly. By the time we're at the end of book 2 or start of book 3, most of our characters have come together already, or are starting to interact in meaningful ways. And I think that's just something that A Song of Ice and Fire is lacking. And I think that that's going to make it much easier for Brandon Sanderson to come up with a meaningful conclusion to this series. So yeah, in conclusion, I guess the reason I'm making this video is just to kind of get this point across that whilst I think that A Song of Ice and Fire holds a special place in our hearts for anybody who's read it, particularly people like myself who read it early on in our fantasy journey, early on in our journey into this type of art, because fantasy is art, and fantasy can honestly be a medium for bringing some of the best out of literature, right? Because you can really, you can have different analogies, you can let your mind run wild. It's really a way of bringing the, the imagination side of things into the emotional side of things. You can do these two things. And I think that A Song of Ice and Fire, as I said, holds a special place in our hearts for people who, people who got to it early, people who it was their introduction to fantasy. Plenty of people like myself might have watched the show and then been like, damn, this looks good, and wanted to come back into it. And so I think that, yeah, it's never going to lose that. But what it has lost for me, personally, and I think that maybe for a few of you out there, is that it's lost that idea that it's the best, and that it even could or should be the best, because I think that ultimately it's unfair to call an unfinished series a series that never really achieved what it set out to do, and a series that I don't think can achieve what it set out to do. I think it would be unfair to call that better, and unreasonable to expect it to even to be better than, some of the flagship series by some other more motivated and more more motivated and more talented authors, arguably. So yeah, thanks very much for watching, and have a great day.